Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 7th Imagine webinar with our special guest, Professor Gérald Bronner. Maybe as a start and a short introduction, as you might remember from last webinars, we have started these moments of reflection somewhere in summer last year, in June 2020. And the idea is that we use this moment, this 1 hour of reflection time, to provide us a broader perspective, provide us and expose us to different topics that might not come to us every single day, that give us some time to just step outside of the action and think about everything that's happening in the world. We try to bring some thought leaders that bring some non-traditional views, that have expertise in non-traditional areas, and we try to help them, or we try to have them help us reflect on how we live, on what different perspectives are, and to help us connect the dots. And it's what we call the multi-level thinking that we have been talking about quite a lot. We've had very interesting topics beforehand. We've talked about what's a business for. We've talked about putting the care in healthcare. We've talked about strange topics like what's your street race. And we've also talked about health and well-being in the digital age, something which is quite close to what we will be discussing today. Let me start by introducing our special guest, Gérald Bronner. Gérald is a professor of sociology at the University of Paris Diderot, and he's a member of the Académie Technologique and the National Academy of Medicine over there. Gérald has worked and is still working very, very actively on the notion of collective beliefs, on errors of judgment, and on their potential social consequences. Gérald has written quite a number of books for which he has received multiple prizes. The last prize that he received was the European Amalfi Prize for his book La Pensée Extrême, the extreme thinking, and has now written a book which is called Apocalypse Cognitive, the cognitive apocalypse. So Gérald, welcome to this call.
Merci Nico.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you to all of you.
Gérald, what I would like to do is ask you some questions which will enable you to explain your thinking about this concept of the cognitive apocalypse, and maybe start by the combination of two quite positive evolutions in our society. On one hand, you've written in your book about the availability of our brain space today, and that availability has become much bigger because many of our concerns, our initial concerns, have reduced. And secondly, there's also the concept of overload of information. There's a lot of information available out there. It's called the information obesity, as you call it. Could you explain a little bit those two concepts, but how they could potentially lead to some challenges that we are facing now?
Oui, merci Nico, c'est une très bonne question.
Yes, thank you, Nico. Excellent question indeed. It's with good news that I'll kick off. You have the link of these two good news. This triggers a situation that is rather specific. First good news, the increase, spectacular increase that is, of what we could call mental availability. What does this mean? Question mark. Well, it means the fact that a day equals 24 hours and we are obliged to work during the whole day. We spend biological time, we sleep, it takes time, it's time consuming to sleep, a third of our lives. The fact that we need to wash, sleep, and eat. This is time we're not available, in fact, if you think about it. We're not available to be creative. And of course, this is the most positive character of our mind. That's what we do best than animals and machines. If you take history, there are a certain number of variables, social variables. Improvement in public health meant that it freed time, brain time, mental time. For instance, the fact that our work is more and more productive, the increase of productivity at work means that we work less than previously. Bear in mind that at the beginning of the 19th century in France, so the figures are French figures, but they're similar in other industrial countries. Work in France represented 40% of our work. Today, it represents 10%. Thus, it means that we have much more labor productivity. We have now different robots that help us, washing machines, etc., that mean that we need to spend less time washing our clothes, etc. And also there's the right to work, labor law, etc. If we take into account that life expectancy has increased, etc., etc., all this means that we have this treasure. That's what I explain in my book, and we're freeing our brains, our minds, and that's what I explain in my book. And of course, we have a lot of space available, but what are we going to do with this space available? Second variable, enormous variable, it has to do with the increase of the availability of the information. Think in the years 2000, since the year 2000, we've produced more information than previously. In 2005, we produced quantities, humongous quantities of gigabytes. We had produced, we are producing more and more. Last figure to understand what we're talking about, the information volume available. These 2 last years, we have produced 90%. Thus, it's an exponential increase of this information, more and more information. We're bombarded with information. It could be positive. You could think that's good. People are going to use this availability, brain availability, to learn things, to make things evolve in a rational way. But unfortunately, it's not what we notice. And it's a very massive question, but our brain, of course, cannot process all the information. In this mass of information, it's going to process more prevailing information. Why is some information more prevailing than other types of information? And I'm going to talk about the cocktail party effect. Cocktail party effect, I repeat. It's known, it's a notion that's been known since the 50s in psychology. It states this: when you are in a party, cocktail party, for instance, you're chatting with someone and you think that you're actually not listening to the noise around you. It's true that our brain is nevertheless processing the other information. So if you hear something, you're going to pay attention. For instance, if your Christian name is mentioned, your Christian name is mentioned, your brain is going to be aware of this. And that's why we're talking about ego-centered information. If the word sex is pronounced, your brain is going to pay attention. If a conflict is mentioned, everyone's going to pay attention. Some information have this capacity to indeed catch our curiosity. And if you think about internet, etc., we are bombarded with all this information, and also all that is conflictual attracts or draws our attention. Also, it's going to use our space available in our brain against our will in some cases. And there's this cognitive apocalypse phenomenon. The information that draw attention are not always the most rational information, and it does not mean that you can be serene vis-à-vis what you're actually hearing.
You talked about the cocktail party. It sounds like a vague memory I have on something I used to do 1 year ago, but we can't do anymore. Just to be clear, what you're mentioning was there before the pandemic, right? It's not something that has come with the pandemic. It was already there before COVID-19 started ruling our worlds and our thinking. Am I correct?
Oui, tout à fait.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. Excellent remark, by the way. What I've just described during these first minutes is a situation that dates back to the end of the 90s, beginning 2000. What I call deregulation of the information market. What does this mean? It means that previously everyone did not have access to the public market of information. If you had a view on the world, you could write an article if you were a journalist. You had to be recognized, or if you were the boss of a trade union or the boss of an organization, you could take the floor, but not everyone could take the floor. And now it's become democratization of the info market. You can contradict a doctor regarding the vaccine question, for instance. So it's positive, but it's also negative, because everyone can take the floor, anyone and everyone. And this situation is prior to the pandemic, of course, but the question of the pandemic, in a way, has amplified, I would say, what I've just described for different reasons. First reason being a pandemic situation. It's not the first time that we've had a pandemic on Earth. And whatever the political context, it means that there's a request for information. When there's uncertainty within a framework of a pandemic, it triggers a request for information because we feel involved and we do not have all the information. We have not received all the information. Today, and at the beginning, we have not yet received the necessary information in order to understand what's happening. But also, we'd like to receive information on the why. We do not know precisely the origin of this pandemic. The origin is probably an animal origin, but nevertheless, this answer is not enough for some. Some want this pandemic to answer the question why, and then you're pinpointing mankind, because mankind unconsciously did what he did, and what happened is that this virus escaped and we ended up with this pandemic, and this hypothesis is not very probable. Also, the question of the why can lead to who, and then it can lead to the question of the conspiracy theory. Some say that the virus has been created intentionally to eliminate populations. Different theories are there. The pandemic situation triggers the research of information. I'd like to add, and this is, we have the figures, the pandemic triggered at a global level in March, April, May, a confinement, lockdown, and this lockdown freed brain space, availability, brain-wise. And we have the digital world in April in France. 150. We had plus 150% social networks involvement, participation, and as we all know, YouTube and these networks are not always that relevant. But what we noticed during this period is an increase of what we call the Kruger impact. It means that we start focusing on a question, COVID-19, epidemiology, and very quickly we feel that we are competent, but actually more competent than we are. But the reality of the matter is that we are not sufficiently competent to realize that we are incompetent. And we are going to talk on the social networks more than those who know, more than the experts. Those that know more than us, the experts, are aware, and they're perhaps not going to take the floor as much because there's this kind of cacophony. It's crazy, and it means that what the World Health Organization called a pandemic of wrong information, false information.
Thank you, Gérald. Maybe I can also ask that people, if you have questions, please feel free to post them in the chat, and we will, the second half of this session, of course, go to those questions. I want to come back to this pandemic of information, which is a pandemic next to the corona or the COVID pandemic. I have the impression that in previous age, when there was World War II, when people were landing on the moon, the information was there, of course, less available, but also was much more balanced. You had positive news, you had negative news, and basically they both came at a sort of similar pace. My impression, and I want to validate the assumption with you, is that these days, negative news actually comes on top and is much more present than positive news. And do you feel that it's a correct assumption, do you feel, what are the reasons for that? And do you feel that the media plays a role in that and can play a role in turning that around?
Oui,
Yes. Thank you for the question. I have the same feeling as you, Nico. Indeed, negativity has always dominated in the media. It's a fact. If you take the journalist schools, they are always interested. The train that arrives late is more interesting than the train that arrives on time. Okay. Nevertheless, this information market was regulated for a very long time by the journalists, etc. Thus, I suppose that the idea was to inform in a rational way, and they didn't depend as much as today on the demand. You have competition on this media market was much weaker. Now we have much more pressure, competition. We've reached levels, incredible levels never reached previously. Someone with a Twitter account, Facebook, can be in competition with a journalist, can state what he or she feels, can say what he or she thinks about the vaccination programs. We can all forward our views, and we've all become mediators. We are all mediating information. We are publishers of information, which creates great competition with the media, and a lot of advertisement is observed. You have the webs, you have the web, you have Facebook. There's a redistribution. Advertising redistribution is based on the digital impact we have as internauts. If we're interested in this or that, we kind of become, in brackets, specialized, and the information supply, in order to survive, needs to be indexed on the demand information-wise. So our intellectual obsessions, that's what I mean when I talk about this matter, this cognitive apocalypse, doomsday. It's about the obsessions of humanity. Apocalypse means revelation, okay? So it's a kind of a revelation of our obsessions, and being negative, it's one of the obsessions of the human brain. One example, if I may, amusing or sad. Russian media online announced that one day, giving a date, they would only use good news, because often the journalists are accused of disseminating negative news. And indeed, what happened is that they lost a lot of followers, 70% of the followers that day. There's kind of this negativity in our brain. What is the reason? Question mark. It's perhaps a hypothesis. A lot of colleagues feel that our brain it comes from ancestors that lived in a very hostile world, meaning that previously they had a brain more attracted by danger, risk, all that was negative, and it was about surviving. Thus, we are the descendants of these people. It wasn't really problematic, this heritage, when the information market was regulated. Since the information is no longer regulated, is deregulated, and it focuses on obsessions, it's as though the prehistoric man was once again present here.
Interesting way to put it, this protection against danger that leads then ultimately to look for that negative information. There must be a silent majority out there, a silent majority that is looking for positive news. Your example, while in a way funny, is extremely sad, of course, of the Russian media center. How can society in general, how could a company like UCB think about bringing up that silent majority, making sure that there is an equal voice between the positive and the negative? Somebody in the chat posted, how do we ensure as UCB we don't take a futile fact and make it bigger? Any advice for us on how to have that silent majority speak up and get some level of equal voice, Gérald?
C'est une excellente question, car c'est probablement
Excellent
l'un des
question,
cœurs du problème.
because it's probably at the heart of the problem. As I said earlier on, internet, deregulation of the information market, but the information world. It's a good news in a way. Yes, it's a good news, but except that it's a strange democracy, because in this democracy, some people vote 1,000 times, others don't vote at all, meaning that some groups, organized groups, militant groups, they are motivated to forward their views. It's their right, freedom of speech. They're going to talk much more than others, more often, in a more violent way, are going to forward their views and support their views or have social visibility. And other citizens that are not sure vis-à-vis the questions will not be represented like the others. That's why views that did not exist previously, radical views, now these radical views are present right, left and center in the public space. We're talking about public health. The anti-vaccines, the anti-vaccination groups represent a small minority of people. More people are in favor of the vaccines, but these anti-vaccination people are very active and proactive. There's a study that was published regarding Facebook in the States on the activity of the anti-vaccines, pro-vaccination, anti-vaccination. The anti-vaccination people are going to look for neutral pages. They're going to try and address a certain number of our citizens. And if you're not a technician, of course, you raise questions regarding allergy, shocks, etc., and secondary effects. Of course, side effects. And if it's about finding answers, and often the answers that are the most visible are carried by active minorities. Thus, there should not be censorship as far as the minorities are concerned. You don't know where that could lead us, because censorship is never good. But a good way of answering, as you suggested, is that the silent majority, that we take the whole space we need to take in this digital space. It's become a citizen space. I would say that it's a new form of a new space for militants, and thus we need to occupy the space. It's a bit a question of tactics, a question of defending democracy. We need to fight with our competences, and we should no longer remain silent. I can understand that some citizens remain silent because the others are often perceived as being aggressive. Often you think, wait a minute, I've got nothing to win here, so you're not going to act and react or walk the talk. But nevertheless, what's important is our own respect. It does not concern just the citizens. We are all wage earners. We have different functions and we have competences, skills. We work for a company. You can be a farmer. I discuss matters with farmers, and they suffer from agri-bashing. Agri-bashing, people that are bashing them systematically, traditional farming, and they are on Twitter, these people that do agri-bashing. And now the farmers are counter-attacking, because it's as though these people who are not farmers know more about farming than the farmers themselves. Okay, it's about acting as a citizen, and you need to counterbalance the minorities.
Interesting questions coming in from the chat, and so I'll take those and ask them first in French and then in English, and then you can respond. Il y a quelqu'un qui dit l'obsession pour le.
Someone is saying that the obsession for the negative journalism. Well, is it something global? Question mark, or does it vary based on the different types of cultures?
Or do you see differences in different cultures? Est-ce qu'on peut apprendre quelque chose de différentes cultures?
And can we learn something from the different cultures?
Oui, bien sûr. Là,
yes, of course. There, indeed, what we call negativeness bias. It's not variable. It's present in all cultures. It does not mean that it is not impacted by social cultural variables. In other words, the same invariable is not going to be presented based on the different cultures. If you take the perception of risk, we all tend to multiply small probabilities. When we hear that there's a small risk, we multiply this risk by 10 or 15. We amplify very small risks. For instance, vis-à-vis being afraid of the vaccine. Indeed, there are side effect risks, etc. But it's a very small part of the sample, and we're nevertheless obsessed by this. We amplify the risk times 10, 15. This perception of risk, of course, is constant in all the populations, but there are hybrids in France. The perception of risk, taking a risk, is not the same if you compare to the States. In the States, it's a more Protestant culture, and they encourage taking risks, and failure is not sanctioned in the same way than in France. Failure in France is considered as really a black spot on your CV. In other cultures, it's not the case because it means you haven't even tried. What I'm trying to say is that cultural perceptions are different. And that's what we're talking about. I'm interested in hybridation and these different variables.
Continue 1 second on this trend with another question from the chat. Je continue avec une autre question du chat. En fait, vous parlez des vaccins et de toutes les informations qui dans les jours actuels qui se dispersent. Comment est-ce qu'on peut réinstaller, c'est naturellement une question très importante pour nous en tant que société scientifique, comment est-ce qu'on peut réinstaller la confiance dans les scientifiques qui ont vraiment des chiffres, des faits et qui ont apparemment un peu perdu de crédibilité dans les derniers jours avec cette histoire des vaccins. So how can we reinstall some confidence into the scientific numbers and facts and data that maybe has lost some level of credibility in the last days?
Oui, alors ça c'est un de même que
Just like it's a bit of a paradox, this question. The surveys, the studies underline the fact that public opinion tends to trust science. High rates of trust, we're talking 80%, 80. But when we talk about the treatment, the question is, do you trust the scientists dealing with such or such matter, the nuclear question, vaccines, etc.? It's a question that is a very tricky question, awkward question. In fact, there are different elements. I could spend 1 hour answering this question. I'll focus on something that's very concrete, pragmatic. It has to do with scientific communication. In fact, science often has a competitive disadvantage compared to belief. False information is disseminated 6 times faster than true information. So there's a competitive advantage there. False information, wrong information, because take the case of perhaps the suspension of the AstraZeneca vaccine. Putting on hold the vaccine is based on a few cases of thrombosis that are linked with the vaccine. We had 17 million vaccines administered, vaccination, and there's perhaps not even a link between the cause and the effect. It just happened like that. I don't know, the thrombosis, or if you check, you'd probably notice that same week, loads of people broke a leg or an arm or something like that. So perhaps they would have had a thrombosis, whatever. In the human brain, it triggers this cause to effect notion. It's like, and then the result being that the person decides not to go for the vaccination. It's a decision that's not rational. And here the brain focuses its attention on our actions, the fact that there is a small risk rather, and does not bear in mind what will happen if he or she does not go for the vaccine. Science needs to take into account the way our brain works, and it needs to calculate the costs linked to the fact of not acting. €1 in costs triggers 2.5 euros in benefits. It's negativeness, and I know I'm kind of being cynical, but it's important to insist on the cost linked to abstention. The only thing that worked with the anti-vaccine people, the only thing that worked was to confront someone, anti-vaccine person, with someone who was ill, polio or something like that, and this person could have been saved had he be treated with a vaccine. And that's the only reason that means in some cases people do accept to revisit their initial view. It's about convincing the brain, it's about storytelling, and storytelling can be very convincing. You need to bear in mind the knowledge we have today. We have a lot of knowledge regarding the way our brain works. We need to trigger a revolution
on essaie
in that sense.
d'avoir un bon débat. Donc, il y a aussi d'autres opinions qui se viennent dans le chat. Parce qu'il y a quelqu'un qui dit, mais est-ce qu'on n'est pas trop positif sur le vaccin? Pourquoi on parle du concept anti-vaccin? Peut-être on est trop optimiste. Est-ce que c'est quelque chose qui est possible aussi? And we like a debate and we want to bring all sides. So as you can see in the chat, somebody's also asking the question, aren't we too optimistic? And why do we talk about anti-vaccine? Maybe we are too naive and optimistic. Qu'en pensez-vous, Gérald?
Oui, alors je pense que d'une part, nous devons...
I believe that on the one hand, science-wise, we need to make sure that we can bear in mind the minority. If not, there will no longer be science. That's why I was insisting a lot. I'm not in favor of censorship. Some scientists, doctors with their diplomas are also against vaccination. But the mistake would be to science that this is a counter trend to science. You need to bear in mind the rapport between the ones in favor and the others. It's like with climate change. Of course, you have skepticism also, but they represent 3 or 4% of the public global press. So you have 3 researchers that would contradict 97 researchers regarding climate change, for instance. And it's a kind of a rapport that needs to be borne in mind. Concerning the vaccine, it's the same thing. The argumentation in favor of vaccination, it's much more powerful than all that should mean that we should not accept being vaccinated. And you have a report that is clear-cut, many reports that are clear-cut. So I'm not in favor of censorship, but we should not give that much importance to these minorities because, as I said earlier on, the cocktail effect, conflict is a great product. And debates are going to be organized with a researcher and he'll face or he or she will face someone that does not believe in climate change, etc.
Very hot topic, and interestingly enough, our next Imagine webinar will also tackle that topic more specifically. So I propose for this one, we move away a little bit from the vaccines and go back to this information overload and the brain space that you've talked about in the first 15-30 minutes of the call. Gérald, you've talked about more brain space that we have available. How can we put this to use positively? How can we maximize the opportunity that we created for ourselves throughout the evolution of mankind and put it to use in a positive way in the future?
Alors, c'était tout un programme, mais effectivement...
It's quite a program, but indeed, it's a stake. stake for our civilization. The threat is a historical stake, quite honestly. We are at the crossroads. And the way we're going to use our available space in the brain, it's going to design our collective future. Firstly, this digital world is closing us up in what we call kind of echo chambers. We receive a lot of information, but we look for this information that goes in the sense of our expectations and our beliefs. Okay, so this is something this was not invented by internet. It's something that was amplified by internet, computational science. Internet has amplified this notion of echo chambers, digital spaces where we're going to meet people that think just like us. Algorithm, same thing. If you look for a book on Amazon, well, the algorithm is going to mean that you're going to receive advertisements trying to sell books of the same nature as the books you purchased. What we can learn to do is to put on hold our judgment. Before we share, before we like, before we approve information, if we're not very competent, let's be aware of our own initial thoughts. That's about developing a critical mind. And we need to develop, we need to learn a kind of methodology. We have to be cautious in believing that information is true. When we believe information is true, it's often because it's in line with our beliefs. 70% of people share articles whilst just reading the title without having read the content. It's because the title goes in the sense of their beliefs. Let's question our desires, our wishes. What do we believe we know regarding a matter, and what is true? The fact of writing down something is going to enable us to take a bit of distance, and we need to learn the functioning of our own brain. We have to be careful vis-à-vis our intuitions. There are cognitive biases, mistakes in our reasoning, and we're going to consider this as true facts. Our brain is great, but not well equipped to manage some risk situations. For instance, a small example, you can think about this. You'll understand what I mean with this cognitive trajectory bias. Quite simply, to assess a price, you're told that a baseball bat and a baseball ball are worth together 110 euros. Okay? And the baseball bat is worth 100 euros more than the bat. And you ask, how much is the bat worth? So you're being careful. That's good because you feel that it's $10 or 10 euros or $10, whatever. The baseball bat, I don't know, is perhaps worth 100 more than the ball, so the ball is probably worth $10, and that's just not possible because the baseball bat is worth $100 more. If the baseball bat is worth 110 plus 10 means 120 total for the baseball bat and the ball. The true price of the ball is not logical, but it's 5 euros. The ball is worth 5 euros, and the baseball bat is worth 105 euros. 105 plus 5 equals 110. And this is what I mean with the cognitive bias. It has nothing to do with your intelligence or your diplomas. Wrong intuition in our brain, and science has pinpointed more than 150 wrong assessments. I've given you a few examples. And it's this cognitive, you have these cognitive bias, and then you have the social elements, you have stereotypes, prejudice, stereotypes, and all this means that the matrix is such that the best way we can use the availability space available in our brain, we need to learn how to use our brain and to know our brain.
And linked to what you've said before, il y a encore une autre question. Vous avez parlé de risques et d'opportunités. Et en fait, en UCB, on a aussi une notion de risque. Comment est-ce qu'on peut faire l'équilibre entre le principe de précaution, être très prudent, mais quand même ne pas sous-estimer, mais aussi pas surestimer les risques? How can we find the balance, which also lives in UCB? And how can we find the balance between, on one hand, being careful, but on the other hand, not overestimate the risk, not overestimate the negative possibilities that are there?
Tout à fait, c'est une bonne question aussi.
Absolutely. Also a very good question. We need to be able to decide. The political figures need guidance. There are risks. The risk could be to underestimate a danger and to overestimate a risk, meaning that you're not going to manage the danger in question. I would say that the rule that you need to bear in mind, even if it does not resolve everything, it enables to avoid a certain number of failures in these two situations you mentioned. You need to have consideration for the possible consequences linked to our actions. We need to have scenarios in mind. If we do this, it's going to lead to that. We need to think about the consequences of the fact that we do not act. If we do not act, what will be the consequences? Question mark. We need to focus our attention on the consequences, and we need to compare the consequences of the fact of not acting. Here, I'm not going to ask you to resolve this problem, but you'll understand the difference or differences. Two people that are betting on horses. First person bets on the first horse, horse 1 or horse A, and it's horse B that wins. And the person did not act. This person kept her money. The other person bet on horse B, then decided to bet on horse A. We have two people that lost 10,000 euros at the end of the day. Economically speaking, they've invested the same thing. They should be at the same level. But psychologically, it's not the same thing, because the first person has to indeed accept the consequences linked to the fact of not acting. But the second person will have to manage the fact that she did something and it led to a loss. And often you're kind of blind, and it's the question of the principle of precaution. We need to have more wisdom in order to move forward. And it's true that
it also puts into contrast reflection and action, or non-action and action. So thank you for that, Gérald. Maybe going back a little bit to the pandemic. So at the moment we have of course, a clear short-term risk of the screen fatigue that we all have, right? This is the only interaction we have. It's always at the screen, and at some point it's clear that it will influence our well-being, our burnouts, and all of that. Now, if we dream about the cocktail party of the future, which means that we're back in a normal world, and everything is back to somewhat normal, what are the long-term risks if we don't manage this information obesity, this information overload? What are the long-term risks?
Alors, on prend toujours merci pour cette question. On prend toujours un risque.
Thank you for the question. You're always taking a risk when you have a diagnosis regarding the future. It's an interesting intellectual exercise, nevertheless, because the future is already in the present, meaning that there's already the shadow. And if you think about it, risks are in fact already there. And if you take our brain and the way it functions, the youth lack patience compared to the elderly. We all know this. When you order something online, we all order online, and people are willing to pay more to receive the order quickly. And the concentration capacities of the youth are lower, but hoped that the younger generation could multitask more, but cognitive science demonstrates that it's not the same, that it's not like that. The youth can multitask, but not cannot dot the I's and cross the T's, fine-tune their work when multitasking. And a concern is that this risk, this credulity, and it's about the real life. I'm not going to be political here, but if you take the credulity flows, it can have impacts on democracies. The risk is, and that's what I called in another book, the democracy of the credulity. The medias are more and more influenced by what we are asking, influenced by the public opinion, the fact that we tend to believe things even if they're wrong. So a number of big public decisions, energy-wise, communication-wise. If you take the 5G antennas, is it dangerous? Question mark. What should we do with these antennas? What about the conspiracy theories? What about vaccines? Are they dangerous? It all has an impact on our collective lives. If people remain gullible, credulous, then we'll remain in democracies of the gullible. It's a kind of, it's dystopia. Knowledge equals utopia. There's an arm wrestle really between the two. And for the time being, what we notice is that the match is not over, but there's an advantage as far as the democracy of the gullible is concerned. It will be based on the way we act in a responsibility to defend the fact of being rational at the end of the day.
Thanks a lot, Gérald. Thanks a lot. As we're talking about the future, somebody posted a nice point in the chat. Quelqu'un a dit quelque chose de très intéressant sur le futur parce qu'il dit, il ou elle dit, si j'achète quelque chose dans un supermarché, il y a sur l'étiquette ce qu'il y a dedans. Est-ce qu'on peut imaginer qu'en regardant les informations qui sont là dans le média, on a la même chose, qu'on sait c'est quoi la précision de l'information qu'on lit avec un certain score. Now, if I buy something in the supermarket, I can read the ingredients on the box. Could we imagine something like that on content and accuracy in media and information?
On peut parfaitement l'imaginer, c'est une bonne remarque.
We can imagine that perfectly well. It's ongoing, by the way, in a certain number of countries. There are bodies that are there to certify information, to state if they feel that this site is perhaps not relevant, is a radical site. They kind of have warnings. They use warnings with colors, for instance, but unfortunately it doesn't work very well, these warnings system, this system with warnings, because those that are convinced that the government is lying, the media is lying, and if you take the trust barometer, it was published 2 weeks ago, a fortnight ago. It underlies the fact that in many countries, people distrust more and more the media. And of course, the reading will be the other way around. Red is going to become positive and green is going to become negative. What's going to happen is that, and that's what we see, there'll be kind of a segmentation of the common space. Normally, we have common discussions, a common bucket for our discussions. In the States, MIT carried out a big study on the state of the information market, more specifically the media, and discovered that today the Republican media hardly ever mention the Democrats and vice versa. There's a kind of separation there. In France and in other countries, it's not the case. If you take right-wing media, left-wing media, they carry on mentioning each other. the left wing mentioned the right wing and vice versa. But in the States, for the time being, it's no longer the case. It is extremely difficult to progress. Then the fact of indicating a certain number of information on food that you're going to buy does not mean that you're going to reset trust. Often you can't re-trigger trust. You have this information that's going to be interpreted in a negative way. People are going to look for wrong information on the label, and people are going to find, for instance, a topic meaning that there'll be no trust, and the problem is rather complex. There is no unilateral answer, but at the same time, it's true that clarifying the origin of the sources, it's important mentally, it's healthy mentally. If we can teach the youth to check the origin of the information, it wouldn't be bad. It would be a good thing.
I propose, in view of time, that we take two more questions, maybe one from the chat again. Encore une question du chat et après la dernière question conclusive. Comment est-ce qu'on peut, en tant qu'individu, gérer nos biais cognitifs, hein, et quand on processe de l'information, quand on prend des décisions, comment est-ce qu'on peut gérer ce biais et être positif sur cet aspect-là? How can we as individuals manage our cognitive bias in processing information, in taking decisions?
Oui, ben, évidemment, c'est la question des questions. Hein,
of course, it's the question of the questions. It's a central question. It can't just happen like that. Those that wish to progress, it's a mental capacity. You need to be aware of your cognitive data. Reading books can be useful. Knowing your cognitive bias. David Kalman, System 1, System 2, very interesting book. There's this notion of cognitive bias, important books, but you can work also differently. Myself, for close to 1 year, I accepted to participate in a governmental project with the youth that were radicalized, not to tell them they shouldn't believe in Islam, of course, but to see what type of reasoning could lead to the situation. And once again, we talk about the conspiracy theory here. I analyzed the type of reasoning and I tried to give them food for thought, intellectually, mentally. It's doable, it's feasible. You can progress mentally. There's no reason why you should be stuck in this cognitive element. And also, it's about searching through your brain and seeing what can be done.
More complex than that. Final question, and maybe short, Gérald. We've had 55 minutes of really great interaction, great conversation. What are your three key takeaways that you would like to give to the audience that you think would be great for them to take home?
Premièrement, qu'il parte même avec cette
that they bear in mind this good news that the availability of information, mental availability, normally these should be tools, advantages for humanity. Let's keep hope. It should be an advantage for our species rather than a trap for our civilization. Secondly, also as important, the main actor of this story is our brain. Our brain is an amazing tool. It's the most complex of the known universe. 1 billion connections. I mean, it's extremely complex. This tool is wonderful. It has negative aspects, but also very positive aspects. Thus, you should keep hope. We have the resources not to end up in the addiction I mentioned. We have all the resources, but you need to create the social conditions in order to activate parts, the most positive parts of our brain. And we haven't reached our objective, but we need to think better about our situation. And thirdly, that's a bit of a concern, because I mentioned two rather positive elements. We need to remain extremely cautious, aware. We are at a civilizational crossroads, and history, it's about history, and history is in our hands, us citizens, us institution, as universities. We need to manage the situation. Let's be careful not to be drowned here with the gullibles and the credulous.
I heard you say two good things. One may be risk, so that overall is still a +1 on the positive side. I would like to really deeply thank you for this conversation. I believe it has been very instrumental in opening our minds. It's been a great experience for me to be able to exchange with you. So a major thank you. Un grand merci, Gérald. And it's very clear that you have a great explanation. So I'm sure that your books will be equally interesting for all of us to read. I also want to thank Alex, the translator. Always interesting to translate two people that speak very fast, I realize. Thank you, Veronique. Thank you, Chiara. Thank you, Viviane. Thank you, Cédric, to make all of this happen and to create this great reflection moment. Maybe to conclude on my side, what I would invite everybody to do, this is not an action meeting. This is a reflection meeting. And so maybe you can use the next days or the next hours to reflect on what is for you the biggest discovery you've done today during this webinar. What is for you something that struck you, that is key for you to remember, and that you might want to share with your family members, your friends, or you talk about it with your colleagues. Maybe even more important, what will you remember in 6 weeks from now? Because what you remember today and tomorrow is one thing, but what will you remember 6 weeks from now? And how will I personally manage this information obesity that comes our way, and this information overload that is quite interesting, but potentially a little bit dangerous. Let me conclude by also inviting all of you for the next Imagine webinar, which is on April 13th. It is, as we already mentioned shortly, a session that will be with Professor Heidi Larson. She is a UK-based anthropologist. She focuses on the analysis of social and political factors that affect uptake of health interventions. Of course, extremely interesting at these days when the health information and rumors around clinical trials are circling around. So I'm sure you will be equally present in that one as in today. Thanks a lot for your attention. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time on the next Imagine webinar. Have a great day.